My guest today is Rupert Darwall.
I'm very pleased to be joining you today. I'm a great admirer of the battle you wage through Twitter. Successfully, you just put to the sword so many of these, dare I say it, climate idiots. It's a fantastic spectacle. So I'm the author of two books. The first one was The Age of Global Warming, which I think came out in 2013. And that was followed by the book I think we're going to talk about, which is Green Tyranny, exposing the totalitarian roots of the climate industrial complex. So there's quite a lot in that. I am a senior fellow of the Real Clear Foundation, and I'm writing a lot on energy and climate and the economic and political consequences of those.
Okay, I have a quote to read you here. Quote, Rupert Darwall is like a hyena in pursuit of his quarry. It may take time, but his bone-crushing jaws offer no escape. He is relentless, end quote. I love that quote.
Thank you. Yeah, that was from a review of The Age of Global Warming. I mean, I'm fine to be compared to a hyena, but I mean, the thing is, Tom, that I think what that also shows is this is the reason why they won't debate us, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is.
They run away from debate, which is why what you're doing is really, really important. And I'm sure we'll come on to this, but the penultimate chapter of Green Tyranny is called The Spiral of Silence. And it outlines the mechanism by which the establishment and what we now call the mainstream media can push to the margins debate and dissent. Even though people believe things, if things aren't talked about, if their beliefs aren't articulated in the media and they don't hear their friends talking about it, eventually it goes to the edge and you have this spiral of silence, and that's how they win.
So you've been watching this for a long time, right? And do you think it's getting worse now, the censorship, or has it peaked, or what do you think?
That's a very good question. I think it's peaked in that it's been revealed. The extent of this, what's been going on, is now, thanks to Elon Musk, is being revealed. So I think there is going to be a really big pushback on censorship. And what I am absolutely staggered by is how you have Democratic congressmen and women openly justifying censorship and actually calling for more censorship. This is so antithetical to what a democracy is about. I think this is a peak moment. I think it's a really important moment in our history that this is being exposed, and I think there will be a successful pushback on it.
I'm curious, with Twitter opening up, do you think that's going to put pressure on YouTube and Google, et cetera, to open up?
There's no way they're going to open up. I mean, there's no way they're going to say. I think that's my instinct. The woke ones, the climate industrial complex has got their tentacles well into these organizations. And why would they risk their staff revolting against top management to open this kind of stuff up? You saw that with Disney. So I think it's unlikely. I mean, it may be eventually commercial pressure changes, but we're a very, very long way from a market-based reaction rather than a political backlash. I mean, there's clearly a huge political backlash going on, and long may it continue.
How about over there in your neck of the woods? Is it opening up in terms of GB News and Talk TV? Do you see some hope there?
I'll tell you what's opening things up is we've had the Twitter files in the US, and we've had the lockdown files in the UK. And that was 100,000 WhatsApp messages that the former health secretary, who was Mr. COVID lockdown, and pushing for more and more stringent restrictions, earlier restrictions, harder restrictions, all the while having an illicit and probably illegal relationship with one of his advisors, which forced him to resign. But those WhatsApp messages, I think, have blown the lid on the cynicism and the manipulation of the government. And there will be a read across to climate because there's cynicism and manipulation there as well.
Maybe we should drop back a little bit and talk about your books. I've been, in the last 24 hours, I've been reading Green Tyranny and putting tons of clips on Twitter. I'm totally loving all the work you've done there.
So the first book was The Age of Global Warming, and I dated the start of global warming as a political phenomenon to 1988. And three things, in fact, four things happened there. You had James Hansen's testimony to the Senate, which happened in June 1988. About a couple of weeks after, you had the Toronto Climate Conference, which announced it wasn't a UN one. But it was the Canadian government which held the G7, held a climate conference to push the climate agenda, and you also had a G7 meeting in Toronto, which put climate change on the international agenda. In the autumn, you had Margaret Thatcher making a big speech on climate change, her famous Royal Society speech. And later that autumn, you had the formation of the our friends in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So 1988 was a really big year. And it coincided, and it wasn't accidental, with the de-escalation of the Cold War. So 1988, you had the INF Treaty was already underway, which essentially was the Soviet Union conceding that its gambit of putting SS-20s into Eastern Europe to detach the European bit of the Atlantic Alliance from the American nuclear umbrella, which it was a really bold, daring move to essentially de-link the Atlantic Alliance. By then, Gorbachev had realized that wasn't working, and we were onto a path to de-escalation. And one of the big ideas in that book is that climate change, a political phenomenon, it needed the end of the Cold War. It needed geopolitics have really been anesthetized. And of course, we're now going into a new geopolitical era with Sino-American rivalry, and I think it needs saying that the climate agenda cannot be pursued at the same time as America, if you like, standing up and containing Chinese expansionism. But coming on to 1988 was the moment it got on the political agenda. But what really surprised me as a result of that book, someone from continental Europe got in touch with me and he said, "You don't know about Sweden?" I said, "Yeah, I don't know about Sweden." And he said, "Do you realize that in 1974, the Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme said that by the end of the 20th century, climate change will be the biggest issue facing the world?" That is, was the guy a prophet? No, he's more than a prophet. What he did was the Swedes played a pivotal role in getting climate put onto the political agenda. It's no accident the first chair of the IPCC was Bert Berlin, who was a scientific advisor, no less, to Olof Palme. And before that, the Swedes put acid rain onto the political agenda as well. They did that for the same reason, which is that Sweden is a country. It's got lots of woods, it's got lots of lakes, but it has virtually no coal, and it was reliant on imported energy. And the Swedish Social Democrats wanted an independent energy source, so they said they wanted a huge nuclear power program. And they knew it would be unpopular, so they said, well, if we don't have nuclear power, we're going to have coal-fired power stations. And by the way, do you know what coal does? It destroys your forests, it ruins lakes, it acidifies lakes. So the first thing they did was acid rain. And two years later, global warming was the next one, that the world would be ruined by global warming and climate change. So there was the key thing, Tom, is there was a political motive for both these scares.
I have an interesting nugget here from your book. Quote, as late as 1989, Greenpeace International was being told by its scientists to stay away from the issue, the global warming issue, because the science was too uncertain, end quote. I had no idea that was happening in 1989.
So the NGOs took time to realize the potency of global warming. It was the key that unlocked the fortress, as it were, global warming was. But they were they rightly saw that in the 70s and 80s, the biggest beneficiaries would be the nuclear industry, because that's exactly what had happened in Sweden. So they were obsessed with basically shutting down the nuclear industry at that point.
So yeah, you said that Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth had spent much of the 1980s campaigning against nuclear power. And to this day, I guess they're still not giving it the rubber stamp that that's what we need to solve global warming. They still want to use wind turbines and solar panels, right?
Yeah, there's a reason for that, and that's to do with Germany. That the 1970s, I mean, I mentioned the Cold War, the SS-20s and so forth. So the 1970s saw Germany was riven by domestic terrorists who were followers of the Frankfurt School, the 1968ers. So the student radicals of 1968, some of them turned into terrorists, Bader-Meinhof gang being an example. After things calmed down, the Social Democrat Party under Helmut Schmidt, like Sweden, wanted to have a big nuclear power program. And this set off spontaneous anti-nuclear protests. I mean, massive protests against civil nuclear power in Germany. And then when later in that decade and into the 80s, you had NATO and the Atlantic Alliance saying, well, we're going to position cruise and Pershing missiles in Western Europe to counter the Soviet threat of their medium-range nuclear missiles. And the anti-civil nuclear power movement turned into the peace movement, basically anti-Atlantic Alliance. And these people, the future Greens, the Greens Party was formed in 1980, and the leadership of the Greens came from those 1986 radicals. It also, Tom, and very importantly, contained neo-Nazis and old Nazis. It's like the post-war era and the pre-war era linking arms. So Germany, the Greens in Germany were formed as an anti-nuclear movement. And therefore, there's no way that they could say, oh, yes, here's climate change, nuclear power is the solution, because the thing they hate more than climate change is nuclear power. And that remains the case.
In your book, you point out a lot of parallels or a lot of beliefs that the Nazis had that are the same as the modern Greens, in terms of they were vegetarians and they were putting up big wind turbines. Do you want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, it happens, Tom. It happens to be a historical fact. And now you've got this information, I think you're going to deploy it widely on Twitter. But the hard truth is that the first political party to have a wind power program was the Nazi Party, which they used in the Reichstag elections of 1933. And it wasn't just wind power. They also had, they were actually quite against importing petroleum. So they had their own domestic synthetic petroleum program. They had very high gasoline cost a lot, and they made gasoline so expensive that hardly anyone could afford to drive in Germany. They had hedgerow ordinances and protecting anti-vivisection laws. Virtually every green thing you can see today, the Nazis did it. And the truth of the matter is, the Nazis were Europe's first Greens. That's just the way it is. And that's not to say that wind power is... I think the important thing is that this demonstrates that wind power does not hold the moral high ground. Whatever one thinks of it, it does not hold any moral high ground. A program first supported by the Nazi parties tells you something important.
Yeah, same thing, I guess, about being a vegetarian. It says they argue that meat eating involved inefficient use of the land, and you could just eat the plants because you get more calories that way instead of feeding the plants to animals.
Yeah, they talked about plants and how immoral it was for grain to be fed to animals and not given to humans. They didn't ask people to eat insects, but I'm sure they would have done if someone had put that idea into their head. And they were very against, for example, food advertising. They blamed the food companies, food manufacturers, and food advertising for people's diet. Again, an incredibly modern or contemporary. I mean, in some ways and in bad ways, the Nazis were ahead of their time. There's there's the thing that Adolf Hitler said, why nationalize industry when I can nationalize the people?
I'm going to read another quote here from your book, Green Tyranny. Quote, in North America, acid rain, more or less a fiction, would be seen as a dress rehearsal for global warming and climate change, end quote. You mentioned acid rain, and you also talk about DDT. And do you want to talk about those a little bit?
Yeah, acid rain is really, really important because when the acid rain scare, and we don't need to use inverted commas for that, when the acid rain scare hit, the National Academy of Sciences said the science of acid rain is even more settled than for climate change. The phenomena that they claimed was just the acidification and so forth that they claimed was caused by acid rain turned out to be totally wrong. It wasn't from power station emissions turning rainfall acidic. That was destroying forests and acidifying lakes. It was land use change. So the lakes of the Adirondacks, for example, which is the poster child of acidification. So when Teddy Roosevelt, I think shortly before he became president, he was fishing on one of these lakes, and there were lots of big game fish, and everything was wonderful and beautiful. If you go there now, there aren't the game fish. And the reason was that it wasn't to do with power station emissions. It was because the soil there is naturally acidic. And what happened was loggers, the forestry industry came along, they cut down the trees, they burnt the stumps, and they changed the pH of the soil and therefore the runoff. And that actually benefited the lakes, which had more insects, attracted fish and so forth. And then the conservationists came along and said, no, you can't do that kind of stuff. And it returned to what it was before. But what was before that change wasn't from power station emissions. It was because that's what it had reverted to, thanks to the conservationists. And what the shocking thing about this is, if you remember, the first Bush campaign to be the environmental president in 1988, he campaigned to succeed Ronald Reagan as the environment president, and he was going to deal with acid rain. And they got the Clean Air Act amendments, was going through Congress when a huge report, which had been commissioned, in fact, by during the Carter presidency, came out, and it basically said that actually this isn't a problem of power station emissions, it's land use change, and the EPA sat on the report. They tried to get the report rewritten. And if you can look at the report now, and unlike virtually every environmental report you can have, where they have a summary for policymakers and key messages, there's no summary at all. There are no messages at all. It's the key conclusions are sort of dotted through the text. You have to read the whole thing, and there's a reason for that, because the EPA didn't want anyone to know that actually their flagship piece of legislation, when it came to, was completely scientifically wrong. It was just, there was no basis to doing what they said they were doing.
I just want to bring up a point. You mentioned this summary for policymakers thing. You talked in your book about how the first IPCC report was improved. William Kinnenmouth was there, and he said, quote, I doubt whether more than 1 in 20 had read the voluminous report in the time, but nevertheless, the report was accepted on a show of hands, end quote. That's incredibly farcical, I would say.
Yeah, these are the scientists. There was I think, again, this is in Green Tyranny, there was a very small cabal of scientists led by Bert Berlin, the Swede I mentioned. There was someone from one of the foundations. It might have been the Rockefeller Foundation. They met in two places. Bellagio was one, and the Italian lakes. I mean, beautiful, beautiful. These guys know how to they know how to live and look after themselves when it comes to important conferences. It was the creation of the IPCC was very much Bert Berlin's idea, and it was to be used. It had a political point, which was to persuade politicians of the need to cut power station emissions. That was the thing they were really obsessed by. So it's hardly surprising other scientists didn't really get a look in, because it was the course had been set before behind closed doors.
But this was supposed to be the gold standard of science, and it was decided by a show of hands of people who hadn't read the report.
That's right. Okay. That's right. Actually, I should say, Tom, the first assessment report is actually quite quite a good document. I mean, as far as IPCC reports go, it's one of the straight ones. And they really, you then had this I think it was the second one, you have the scandal of the Clinton administration interfering in the drafting of the text. The third assessment report, you obviously have Michael Mann's utterly spurious and fraudulent hockey stick, where to this day he hasn't revealed to anyone his algorithm that is widely believed to produce hockey sticks out of white sand, isn't it? And so there's been a marked decline in the quality of IPCC output.
And to this day, the approval process is behind closed doors, right? For the summary of policymakers, there's no webcam where we can find out what they're saying in there. Right?
I think that's right. I mean, it is the case that the summary for policymakers is also written not just for policymakers, but by policymakers.
Yeah, and then I think there is still a lag where they approve the summary first, then they can go back in and change the underlying documents, I believe.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's not my expertise of the IPCC drafting process.
I want to jump back and make sure that we cover the DDT issue, because you put some stuff in your book that I had not heard about, the thinning of the eggshells happening before DDT was introduced.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to what I would say is the most important, most influential book of the second half of the 20th century, which is Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Its big idea was that farmers in particular were poisoning the biosphere with chemicals, and particularly insecticides. The main one that she focused on was DDT. There was no evidence backing this up, but if you read Silent Spring, it's more like what one might say a prose poem. It's not science at all, but it is the foundational text of the modern environmental movement. So out of that came this campaign against DDT. And thanks to the Swedes and the Social Democrats and to Olaf Palme, the first UN conference on the environment was held in Stockholm in 1972. And just before it, the Nixon administration announced it was banning the use of DDT. So DDT became this hate chemical for the environmental movement, and Nixon decided just to appease that. They weren't going to bother with the science. They were just going to go along with the phony stuff that Rachel Carson had been saying, because that was the extraordinary impact of this book. I think it was 1962 Silent Spring came out. And so within 10 years, that book had helped fundamentally change political attitudes towards the environment and so on.
When you said hating on DDT or the hate chemical, then there was a hate campaign against chlorine too, right? That Greenpeace wanted to ban chlorine.
Yeah, yes, that was Patrick Moore. Yeah, he just said, sodium chloride is one of the most extensive molecules you can find. So it just showed that utter ignorance of science. But going back to Silent Spring, one of the big chapters in that book is what I think it's 1 in 4. And its claim is that 1 in 4 of us is going to die from cancer. And the reason we have cancer is because we live in a sea of carcinogens, things like DDT, caused by things like DDT. This idea that modern civilization is basically carcinogenic there's a very interesting, the genetics of this idea are really, really interesting, because she was influenced in this by a Pittsburgh doctor who before the war in 1933, when Hitler became Chancellor, as we might say, when Hitler seized power in 1933, he wrote a letter to Berlin saying, he was of German extraction, saying, I want to come back to Germany. And he went back to Germany. And one of the key tenets of Nazi medicine is industrialization is bad for people's health. And he took this back to America. He returned to America before the war and then transmitted this idea to Rachel Carson when she was writing Silent Spring. So there is a link between Silent Spring and the pre-war Greens.
And then another topic I wanted you to talk about maybe a little is the idea that in Europe they went to diesel-powered cars and got a lot more pollution in their cities because they were trying to prevent global warming. So they were fighting carbon dioxide, but real pollutants got worse.
That's absolutely right. So the European Commission, the European car industry led by Volkswagen, made a terrible error in their decarbonisation. The idea is that diesel-powered vehicles have got more mileage, therefore they emit less carbon dioxide. And so Europe embarked on a dieselisation program, and car makers would produce more diesel cars. Diesel would be taxed less than regular gasoline. And the effect was, and they knew it at the time, that this would worsen air pollution, urban air pollution. So the trade-off was saving the planet, but worsening the air quality of European cities. And I was always struck when going to the United States that you could breathe freely. The cities, you didn't get that smell of exhaust fumes that you get in European cities. I have to say it's got much better. It's much better in recent years. But there was a time, I can tell you, Tom, I mean, I cycle a lot I live in London, cycle a lot in London. And there have been times when you caught in a traffic jam on your bicycle, the stuff you've been breathing, you come back with a dry throat. It's horrible. It's really, really horrible. But I think this goes to a bigger point. If you believe in climate catastrophism and the very existence of the planet or humanity is an existential threat, either catastrophism, climate catastrophism, you will sacrifice the local for the global. And this is what we see. Robert Bryce is very good on this in terms of wind and solar farms disfiguring nature. So what you have, the irony, the paradox, indeed the contradiction of modern environmentalism, is the industrialization of nature. That's where it leads you, the industrialization of nature. You destroy what actually is beautiful, and you're destroying habitats for wildlife and so forth. But that sacrifice is worth it because you're doing it for the planet.
Yeah, you talk about putting up wind turbines. First, they put them up in the best locations, but then they start putting them up into forests. So then they need to cut roads through the forest. They need to be straight to get the long blades through the forest.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, excellent points there. And then also you said that the prime locations for wind turbines are up high where there's thermals, and that's where the raptors like to be as well, so that they are very hard on eagles.
Yeah, I think there's this horrible thing that the climate crowd put out, that cats or windows kill more birds than do wind turbines, which kind of misses the point because we're talking about the apex predators.
Right.
We're talking about apex predators as eagles and other raptors. The other thing is what it does to bats. The pressure waves from the wind turbines cause their lungs to explode. I mean, horrible, horrible stuff. And also insects. In Germany, they find that hundreds of thousands of tons of insects are killed by rotating wind farms that are located on insect migratory paths. And of course, that has an impact. You say, oh, they're eating insects, but they're food for birds. So when you're killing masses of insects, tons and tons of insects, you're actually reducing bird populations.
I think you mentioned a solar concentration facility, Ivanpah.
Yeah, Ivanpah it's not solar PV, it uses reflection from sunlight and it concentrates it into a tower at the center of the complex. But birds flying through it they're just incinerated.
Yeah, I guess the correct figure might have been that someone said one streamer every 2 minutes. They call it a streamer if the bird is catching on fire. Yeah, okay. Yeah,
it burns their feathers, so they drop to the ground.
One other interesting thing from your book I wanted to point out is there's a guy named Schellenhuber. He said the carrying capacity of Earth is maybe 1 billion people. But then this quote about an ocean heat belt, quote, that would shock heat the first 10 kilometers of our atmosphere, the layer we live in and where the weather occurs, by 36 degrees Celsius, end quote. I had never heard that one.
The guy. The reason I put that in is Schellhuber is unbelievably vain, and he he believes he's the Einstein of climate. And I mean, he'd be very glad we're talking about him now. But he's basically, he's just far out wrong on the alarmism he peddles. The Potsdam Institute is one of the leading climate alarmist institutes.
Another nugget that I loved out of your book, Green Tyranny, is when John Kerry was talking about unbelievable payouts for climate change disasters, etc. It was costing insurance companies so much money. And Warren Buffett, who was behind one of the biggest insurance companies, said, we don't even consider climate change when we're doing our calculations. But anyway, John Kerry continues, I guess, to to try to sell that idea that climate change is causing insurance problems?
Yeah, the other thing John Kerry said, I think he was in the Pacific, I think it might have been Indonesia, and he said, he said, I don't understand chemistry or physics. I was hopeless at school, but I understand climate, he said, and it's simple. He said, it's like an apple falling on your head. And it's just on his ignorance. And what's really telling is that if you, Tom, made a science mistake on climate change, you can bet there'd be a huge pile on, wouldn't there? Right, oh, look, Tom Nelson, there'd be Kerry says a daft thing about climate, and what do they say? Nothing.
Yeah,
nothing.
Nobody cares.
Yeah.
So do you have any opinions on what's going on with Greta Thunberg in terms of, is she just acting on her own, or is she a puppet? Are there people directing her what to do, what to say?
I'm sure that she is being managed and her parents have a big role in this. But I wrote a piece about 12 months ago with a question mark, which I think I'd now take away, is climate change a tool of social control? Question mark. Let's leave the question mark. It is a tool of social control. And I think it's a tool used by the older generation. We mentioned John Kerry. These people are in their 70s and 80s. They're these aging boomers. And what they do, it's really quite clever. What they say to the younger generation. The reason I said that I was struck by this question was, why is it young people aren't revolting? I mean, up in arms, not needing to wash. Why aren't young people revolting? Because particularly during COVID, they were treated absolutely appallingly. I mean, terribly, terribly, terribly. They had their freedom taken away. They were denied access to in teaching. They couldn't see their friends. They couldn't have a proper social life. Why weren't they up in arms? Why weren't they saying this is dreadful? And similarly with climate change, they are the biggest victims of climate policy. They will bear the cost. They won't have the opportunities that you and I had for travel and stuff, because the whole point is to shut down travel, unless you walk or cycle. And so why is it they are colluding in something that's very bad for them? And the reason is because what the climate catechism does is it elevates the young generation into victims. It puts on the mantle of victimhood on them, elevates them and said, and the older generation said, we're the guilty ones. We've caused this terrible thing, but we're repenting. We're repenting now. We're doing what we can to save you, make your life better. And in a way, what that does is it disempowers young people from actually looking at the world as it is and asking serious questions. Why are they doing this? Why aren't they challenging what they're being told? Because they're the victims. The victim doesn't say, well, actually, why is this person telling this to me? And yes, young people are complicit in this because they know nothing about the past. They don't ask themselves. I mentioned the Toronto Climate Conference of 1988, and its conclusion was that climate change will have an effect second only to a global nuclear war. Right? That's over 3 decades ago. And can anyone say that there's been anything approaching a global nuclear war? I mean, it's such a ridiculous, and this is where the passage of time should be our ally, because what it clearly demonstrates is the catastrophism that is inherent in the climate change narrative simply isn't evidenced anywhere. And yet young people don't look at the record and say, well, actually, what we're being told by these guffers is complete tosh. They're just making this up. They've been going on about it for over 3 decades. And look, the sun's, they don't do that. And that's because as I say, they're elevated as being victims of all this. So they glory in being victims, which is what Rita to, how dare you? It was all about that. She's playing a role. So whether she's managed or not, she's playing a role that the establishment, the elites want her to play, and that's the key thing.
So do you think, looking at your crystal ball, that climate change is still going to be a big thing 20 years from now, or are they going to switch to something else? How long can this particular scare stay alive?
I think if climate change has the dominance in 20 years' time, as it does today, President Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party will have succeeded in its aim of making China the dominant power by 2049, the centenary of the Chinese Communist Party's seizure of power in 1949. So my answer to that is, if it is, you can kiss goodbye to the West. It will, it will have. You can't do the stuff. You can't engage in geopolitical rivalry at the same time as destroying your economy with climate policy. Just completely incompatible.
What else should we be covering here?
The other thing is the nuclear winter. If we look at in Green Tyranny, I think there are three big environmental scares that have come along. The first one we've talked about was acid rain. The third one, obviously, is climate change. The one in the middle was the nuclear winter. And this is a particularly interesting episode because it shows scientists acting as political activists. And the background to the nuclear winter was this was at the height of the Cold War and the showdown between the West and the Soviet Union. The Kremlin had put in medium-range nuclear missiles into Eastern Europe, as I said earlier, in order to detach the two wings of the Atlantic Alliance. And the West's response was to put in cruise missiles and Pershings. And the Kremlin wanted to stop the Western politicians doing this. So it was very involved in the peace movement. It was financing them. Huge protests, particularly in Germany. There were big anti-nuclear demonstrations in New York. And one of their trump cards was the nuclear winter. And according to one Soviet defector, the nuclear winter had been cooked up by the KGB, and the scientists knew it was completely fake. But they planted the story in Stockholm, as it happens, where it got picked up by, I think it was a Rockefeller Foundation executive who briefed some NGOs in New York, and they got the ball rolling. And as a result of that, there was a big conference in Washington where they were all criticizing Ronald Reagan's arms buildup, which they said threatened the world with a nuclear war, which would have led to a nuclear winter and would meant that no one would survive this winter in the Northern Hemisphere. And interesting, the conference even had one of these progressive foundations paid for a televised link to the Kremlin so they could have what the Kremlin thought about this stuff. But there are two things about it. Fred Singer, who's an absolutely amazing scientist, demonstrated that this was a scientific bunkum. He said actually there'd be a slight, if there was a nuclear war, not that he wanted one, but actually it would have a slight warming effect rather than a cooling effect. But the other thing is, it clearly what the scientists and the whole cast of characters, not just scientists, but the NGOs and the media hangers-on, were essentially acting as sock puppets of the Kremlin. And if they had got their way and there hadn't been a Western answer to the Soviet medium-range nuclear missiles, the West would not have won the Cold War. They were undermining the strategy of the West, which turned out to be completely right. And these people were against it. And what's that tell you?
Wasn't Carl Sagan all in on nuclear winter?
He was all in on nuclear winter. He was also all in on, I think, the first Iraq War and the oil fields going up in smoke, and that causing all sorts of climatic problems. I mean, unfortunately, his record on the nuclear winter, he was really far out there as a scientific activist. The one exception to this is Stephen Schneider, who people like us tend to be, very, because he was, I've said, the climate scientists, generally speaking, and the stuff I've read about climate science, I could be quite rude, but they don't come across as the most accomplished scientists, right? Schneider was much more, he was much smarter. Anyhow, he did quite a lot of work on the nuclear winter and completely, he destroyed it. There's an important article he wrote, completely destroying it. So he was, when it came to the nuclear winter, he was one of the merchants of doubt. But you don't hear that. You don't hear that from Naomi Oreskes, and she knew this. I actually could see it from the book. She knew that Stephen Schneider had written an important journal piece demolishing the nuclear winter, but she doesn't disclose that actually he was one of the merchants of doubt, because it doesn't would put a big question mark over the narrative she was pushing. Merchants of Doubt is a really terrible book. I think that goes to show the quality. What I've just said shows the quality of the way she picks and chooses her evidence.
Very interesting. One other nugget I just wanted to bring up here that you included in your book, a 1992 Gallup survey of 400 U.S. experts confirmed that 60% of those experts believe that the global average temperature had increased over the past century, but only 19% of them attributed that to human activities. Well, this whole idea that it's basic physics, Katharine Hayhoe wants us to believe that for 200 years we knew that CO2 was the climate control knob. We didn't, or the experts didn't know in 1992. So things have changed.
Yeah, I think there's this whole campaign. Exxon knew that some scientists in the 1980s who were working for Exxon had told Exxon, your activities are causing climate change. Yet the first assessment report, which, as I mentioned earlier, I think is one of the highest quality documents produced by the IPCC, actually came out with an equivocal verdict. And so how could Exxon know when the IPCC a decade later said it didn't know? And that just shows that the stuff they put out is sheer propaganda. And as I mentioned there, Mia Reskes, she's up to her neck in this kind of stuff. I mean, every time she'll be writing a joint op-ed in the Washington Post or someone sort of saying Exxon knew and blah, blah. It's total rubbish because you've got to go back to that first assessment report and it's equivocal verdict.
Very good. All right. Any other points you'd like to make before we wrap up?
I think that's about it. I think we've blown this dry, haven't we?
I think we have. Yeah, I very much enjoyed this. I hope you can do it again sometime in the future.
Yeah, I'd love to, Tom. This is great fun. It's a great session.
All right. Thank you very much. We'll talk to you next time. Rupert Darwall.